No, this is a public lecture on sleep. This number is greater than the number that we had when we attracted the Premier. Now, I don't know what that means. Does it mean this is a room of insomniacs? Okay, but anyway, let me start off in a more formal way, but we have got more than for the Premier. Welcome. So welcome to Flinders University Victoria Square presence for the lecture by Professor Leon Lack on sleep. I'm Professor Phyllis Tharano. I'm the Executive Dean of the Faculty of Social and Behavioural Sciences. This public lecture is part of our normal public lecture series. What we do in our public lecture series is we have our top researchers take their work, translate it into practical work for a community audience and present their findings to you in a way that makes sense to you, to the community, to government, to industry and other organisations. So our aim is to take our research and make it useful for people. Let me introduce Professor Lack. Now, I've got this little bio on him. He had a degree from Stanford University in the USA and a PhD from the University of Adelaide. We'll forgive him for that. Since 1972, he's worked in the Department of Psychology, which is part of the faculty, and he's been teaching and researching in the area of sleep, circadian rhythms, and insomnia. Now, to do that work, he's received a lot of highly competitive external funding called Australian Research Council grants and National Health and Medical Research Council grants. He also has an extraordinary publication record. He has over 80 refereed journal articles, books and book chapters in the area of sleep. I also saw, now I'm the Executive Dean of the faculty and I'm responsible for the budget. I also saw he's been to over 200 conferences. So I divided 40 years, that's 1972, into 200 conferences, and Leon, you owe us money. So I'm afraid to say that makes 5 conferences a year. So being the Exec Dean, I pay attention to that. Since 1992, for the last 20 years, Leon has done something incredibly important. He's run the insomnia treatment program at the Repatriation General Hospital. That's a very important program at the REPAT. And just to finish off, let me say that he's also taken a very active role in public education, giving a lot of invited lectures, running a lot of workshops, and also giving media presentations. And his aim has been to prevent the development of sleep disorders and to treat them effectively. Now, Leon will talk for about 3/4 of an hour. He won't be held tightly to that. If he goes over, we'll just all fall asleep. No. I mean, it's really easy to make jokes that aren't funny. Okay, so about 3/4 of an hour. What happens after that is we have time for questions. We've also got some networking after that. So afterwards we have food and drinks as well, when you can also catch up with Leon. So over to Professor Lack for his talk, Sleep Well, Live Better, Steps to Good Sleep. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Phyllis. Perhaps I should run for politics if I'm getting a bigger crowd than the Premier. And no, I didn't go to 200 conferences. It was 200 conference papers. Usually we give 5 or 6 conference papers at every conference, so you divide that by 6. Whew. Now, although the title of this, Sleep Well, Live Better, the Steps to Good Sleep, implies that what we're talking about is poor sleep, and people are having sleeping difficulties. And so I'll get right into it. We're talking basically about insomnia. Insomnia is a very generic term and refers to lots of different types of difficulties. It's not a single disease which you can give a pill for that corrects the disease, like pneumonia, you can give antibiotics. Insomnia is really a description about a lot of different behaviors, different thought processes, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. What is insomnia? Well, it can be described as the inability to get adequate sleep given enough opportunity to sleep. It's usually described as having difficulties falling asleep sometimes, perhaps difficulties maintaining sleep or waking up too early, having unrefreshing sleep, and also a number of different daytime symptoms like fatigue, lethargy, memory problems, and just a generally lowered quality of life. It really does produce misery in people, and they are often desperate to seek help. Not only are there daytime consequences of insomnia, but it's also an economic burden on the country. A study was done in 2004 which tried to calculate the total economic cost of sleep disorders in Australia, and it came out to about $7.5 billion. Insomnia is the most common sleep problem, so probably accounted for at least 50% of that cost. People off work, disruption of social relationships, and a whole number of different things. And besides going to medical practitioners, getting scripts for medicine, and buying those medicines on medical benefit schemes and so forth. So it does cost the country quite a bit. It's a prevalent disorder. The estimate is quite rubbery because it depends on how you define insomnia. But if you're just talking about how many people in the population would have insomnia symptoms across the year, we can get up to about 50% of the population would have some experience across a year of difficulty falling asleep or waking up a lot during the night. But if we're talking about the hardcore, chronic, severe insomniacs, it's really between about 5 and 10% of the population. So to give you a rough idea, if we took all of the insomniacs, chronic insomniacs in the Adelaide metropolitan area, we could fill up Amy's Stadium maybe 2 times over. Or if you just got up in the middle of the night because you couldn't sleep, put your robe on and walk down the street, yell out, "Is anybody awake?" And you're likely to find somebody else that's awake. You wouldn't have to go very far before you found somebody else who was suffering from insomnia. All right, so it's a prevalent problem. It's a significant problem. It's not going to kill you, but it does produce misery and a really lowered quality of life. So how about treating it? What do we do? Well, Alfred Hitchcock, for those that are a little bit older, has come up with a novel solution. This music will be familiar to some of you, like myself.
Good evening. I hope you'll excuse me if I appear a trifle excited, but I've just come into possession of a cure for insomnia. It comes in capsule form. For best results, they must be taken internally. Here is the handy applicator. It is an amazingly simple device. An idiot can operate it, and indeed many do.
And I thought that was relevant given the number of shootings around the world these days. Now, the drugs that are used these days are not as deadly as these, but they do have problems which I'll talk about shortly. But probably the most common substances that are used for treating insomnia just in normal everyday life are over-the-counter substances, things that you can buy at the health food shop, sometimes at the pharmacy, include a whole variety of different types of herbal potions and magnets under the pillow and so forth, and virtually none of which have any evidence base to support their use for insomnia. But often people will report, "Oh, this worked for me," and convince their friend who has insomnia as well, "Try this, it worked for me." And they'll go out and they'll try it, and for a few days or maybe a couple of weeks, it will seem to actually help. Because the placebo effect probably works better on insomnia than almost any other problem or disorder. Why? Well, because insomnia often involves anxiety, worry, concern, and heightened emotional arousal. And so anything that'll convince you that something's going to work will relax you and you'll sleep better. Only as long as you are sleeping better, when you start experiencing insomnia again, you eventually decide that whatever you're using, that doesn't work. So this is the 10th thing now you've tried to use and still doesn't work. So insomniacs quite often get very frustrated, feeling powerless in the face of their poor sleep. But if you go to a medical practitioner, their tools of trade are medicines, and they'll be very likely to prescribe a hypnotic drug. A recent study showed that of 95% of people presenting with insomnia as one of the problems that they had, they would get a sleeping tablet prescription. So it's still by far the most used attempt to treat insomnia. But there are problems with sleeping tablets. They do have side effects. Some side effects of some recent drugs have been caught the media attention. Memory difficulties, people coming down in the middle of the night, cooking themselves a meal, going back upstairs, coming down in the morning, finding all these dirty dishes around, and having no memory of them having done that themselves. So there are memory problems often associated with it, balance problems, and this can be a problem for the older population in particular. But the biggest problem probably is drug dependence. Usually a person will get a prescription for several weeks, and at the end of that period of time, their nervous system would have adjusted to them so that when you stop taking the hypnotic drugs, you'll experience, at best, your sleep going back to what it was before you started the drug treatment, but more often, it'll be worse than before you started the drug treatment. And so insomnia withdrawal is a big problem with virtually all of the prescription hypnotics. And that convinces you that you can't sleep without the drug, so back you go to your GP and get another prescription. And so we often find people who have been using hypnotics for years, decades. Some people will put onto hypnotics in their 40s or 50s, and they'll use them till the end of their life. Now, clearly the ones that are used today are relatively safe, but their biggest problem is that they don't really address the insomnia. They'll have the insomnia with the hypnotic prescription. It's just that their sleep is much worse when they don't take it. So this is the sort of better of two evils in a sense. But they'll be using the hypnotic for the rest of their life generally. They'll try different ones, try antidepressant drugs sometimes, but none of them work particularly well. They work very well for the first few nights, and their efficacy tends to drop off with time. The good news is there are some non-drug therapies for the treatment of insomnia that work very well with very few side effects. We're going to be talking about aspects of this type of non-drug treatment. These have been developed mainly from the field of insomnia, or from the field of psychology, and been called cognitive behavior therapy, or CBT. When it's applied to insomnia, it's been called CBTI. What does that mean? Well, there's a cognitive element to it, your thinking processes, your beliefs about sleep, your beliefs about what affects your sleep, and behavioral therapy, so that's what the B stands for, and for the treatment of insomnia. And I'll use some examples of both cognitive and behavioral treatments, which the Flinders sleep research has really been involved in over the past 20 years. I'll emphasize those. One of the studies that we did was to, first of all, find out what people's beliefs are about a normal, healthy sleep. And so we did a large survey amongst the general population and asked them to draw a figure which represented normal sleep of a young, healthy adult. And we laid out this graph with a time chart on it, 2300 to 11 p.m. To about 7 o'clock in the morning. And we described this as being awake in the white, and then lower levels of sleep, going from light sleep, which also included a stage of sleep we call REM sleep, or rapid eye movement sleep. This is the stage of sleep in which generally dreaming is occurring, but we'll place it in the sort of light sleep level there. Then intermediate sleep, stage 2 sleep. I won't go into the description about the physiological changes that take place to describe those stages, but they're well known, and this terminology has been used for the last 50 or 60 years. And then deeper sleep, it gets its name from the fact that it's more difficult to wake up a person out of deeper sleep. All right, so those are the stages of sleep, and what we just asked them to do is to draw this graph which represents in their mind what a good, healthy sleep pattern is like. And this is what they drew. Virtually the vast majority of them did this. Only a few drew a line that was down at the bottom. It wiggled a little bit, but none of them included an awakening out of sleep as part of the normal sleep pattern for a young, healthy adult. So this is the concept of the general population. Probably most of you would feel this is what a good sleep should be like. You gradually go down into deeper sleep. You're there for several hours. You gradually come back out of it again and wake up. Where do we get this concept? Well, maybe from childhood, perhaps, where the last thing you knew at nighttime, your parents were reading you a story. The next thing you know, the sun is shining. It's the next day. So this long period of unconsciousness across the night. And this is a pattern of good sleep. Unfortunately, that is not true. And so this is one of the first things that we present to our clients at the sleep clinic to educate them about the normal sleep pattern. And this is important, and I'll show you why it's important. So cross this out. Eliminate this from your mind now. This is not sleep. So let's explore the real nature of sleep. Here we are at Flinders University. The building on the right is the Social Sciences North building. This is the ivory tower of academics. And my office is up there at the top floor, of course, where I have a beautiful view out across the lake and the courtyard inside. And the nighttime is falling now. And where are my students? Well, they're down in the sleep lab. They're going to be there all night, staying awake, looking at the sleepers. They're doing the work. And if we didn't have postgraduate and honors students, a lot of this work just simply would not get done. So here we are inside LAC's sleep laboratory. Let's take a look inside. And this is what we see, this poor person. And it's true that for good sleepers, virtually all good sleepers sleep worse in a sleep lab under these conditions. They sleep best in their normal bed, in their bedroom environment, with their own Juna, with their own teddy bear, their own pillow, and all those things. Why? Because they go to bed every night. They fall asleep in 5 or 10 minutes. They may wake up briefly across the night, but they fall back to sleep with no difficulty. Sleep is not an issue for them. And they always sleep in their bed and the bedroom environment. So the bedroom environment is a conditioned stimulus for them falling asleep. Just like going to a boring lecture is a conditioned stimulus for falling asleep for many of us as well. But strangely enough, a lot of insomniacs actually sleep better under these conditions than they do in their home environment. And we think that's because the insomniac has developed a conditioned stimulus of arousal in their bedroom environment. And we often get reports from them saying, oh, they're feeling sleepy watching television. They think, great, you know, I can fall asleep easily now. They trundle off to bed, they lie down in bed, and all of a sudden they're like this, broad-eyed, bushy-tailed, and they can't fall asleep. So something has happened. That's not biologically sensible, but psychologically there is an answer to that, which is that their bedroom has become a conditioned stimulus for an alerting response. We call it the fight or flight mechanism. They perceive a threat. The threat is, are they going to fall asleep in time to get enough sleep tonight? Because they have important things to do tomorrow. So worry and concern all of a sudden come into their minds. Thought processes are whizzing around their mind. Extra blood flow goes up to the brain and the conscious areas. And so it is the fight or flight reaction. And then you cannot fall asleep very well under those conditions. So we think that's what's happening to the insomniacs, but brought into the hospital where they don't expect to be able to sleep and they don't have the conditioned stimuli for arousal, they actually sleep better. So what is the nature of sleep across this same period of time? Here's this graph again. We find the stages of sleep vary dramatically and rapidly across the night. This is what we believe, but really the sleep pattern is more like a roller coaster. So this is why I have this person coming down the line, and it looks something like this. So we do, when we fall asleep, we drift into deeper stages of sleep, but fairly rapidly. And after about an hour of being asleep, we're in the deepest stage of sleep, usually of the whole night. But we don't stay there very long. After about 80 minutes, spontaneously, our biological system brings us out of deeper sleep into lighter sleep, and we experience then the first period of REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. Usually that period is very short, very brief. And then we start another plunge down into deep sleep. And then about 3 hours after having fallen asleep, or after another 90 minutes after the first cycle, we come into the second REM period, which is a little bit longer. And so there we go through the rest of the night. These cycles, up and down. I don't know if you've ever ridden on a roller coaster, but that first real dip is the most exciting one, and you're running the fastest. And the rest of the ride is not as exciting, usually, as you finish the ride. So it's a roller coaster affair across the night. And because we come into lighter stages of sleep about every 90 minutes, it's easy to wake up out of those lighter stages of sleep. And so spontaneously, you might wake up. Just becoming uncomfortable lying in the same position is enough to tell the body, turn over, you turn over, and that's enough tactile stimulation to wake you up. And so you're really almost just below the surface of waking up, but now you're awake. Now, in a normal young adult sleep pattern, we often find brief awakenings across the night. In fact, adolescents and young children wake up across the night as well. Not very long, and they never remember these things. So subjectively, as far as they're concerned, they had a solid night of sleep, but they didn't. Sleep isn't solid. It's this affair. And this is not just true for humans, but for all mammalian species, this cyclic affair of sleep. Sometimes ask my clients in the program, the treatment program, why do they think they're there? I just have you ponder that rather than try to get an answer today. You can ask a question about it. But why isn't sleep like that? Why is it like that? Well, we don't really have an answer to that, but that's the way it is. And because it is that way, wakenings are a normal part of the sleep pattern. And so here we find ourselves awake when we thought we should be down here in deep sleep. So that difference between what we see is happening and what we believe should be a healthy pattern is worrying. There's concern. There's some anxiety. And so that's why it's good to get across this notion of the sleep pattern. All right, so here we have this pattern again, and a young, healthy sleeper. I want to try to emphasize now what happens with aging. How does the sleep pattern change with age? We know that other things change with age, unfortunately. Many of them just cosmetic, gray hair, wrinkled skin and things like that, but we're just as vibrant, just as productive in old age quite often as younger people. Have other skills. Perhaps IQ measures have dropped a little bit, but verbal fluency tends to maintain itself. And if you're around long enough, you work your way into higher positions just by accident because everybody else has died off. So here we have the young adult averaging about 8 hours of sleep. And it's only been recently have they done a research study to try to determine, does the sleep need of older people decline? In other words, do you need less sleep when you get older? This has been a big debate in the sleep field for a long time. Some arguing, oh, look at those poor older people. They're only getting 6.5 hours of sleep. They must be really suffering. Because if you gave only 6.5 hours sleep to a 20-year-old, they would eventually start suffering from that. But they don't seem to suffer from it. And then the doctors say, oh, yeah, but look, they take naps all of that makes up for that poor sleep. Well, no, most older people don't take naps during the day. I talk to retirees, and they're busier now than they were when they're in their job. And they don't have time to talk because they've got to go off and do something else. They don't have time for napping. So no, they're getting 6.5 hours of sleep without naps during the day, and they're feeling fine. They're not feeling sleepy or fatigued. But what they did to try to determine sleep need was to put them into the laboratory every night for a whole week, giving them unlimited opportunity to sleep. How much would their sleep mechanism take, given an unlimited opportunity? And indeed, they did sleep longer in the lab situation. They slept about 7.5 hours every 24 hours. And the younger people slept about 9 hours. And so we tend to shortchange our sleep by about an hour a night. And that doesn't seem to hurt us very much. Did they benefit from that extra hour of sleep? A little bit, but not enough to warrant an extra 5 hours of time in bed. It just wasn't worth it for that improved feeling of restedness. So what does the older adult sleep pattern look like? It looks like this. It's shorter, and there are more awakenings, and the awakenings are a little bit longer. There's less deep sleep, but that sleep pattern you see in the red is a normal, healthy sleep pattern for a 70-year-old. And that's all they need to feel fine during the day and to be productive. There's no impairment produced by that. Getting the sleep cycles is really all that's required. And it doesn't matter if there are gaps between the sleep cycles. As long as the gaps aren't too long, and more importantly, as long as the gaps aren't associated with fretting about the fact that you're awake. Probably the sleep of many generations ago, go back 300 or 400 years into Northern Europe, if your ancestors happened to be there in the middle of wintertime, what people do in the wintertime, they'd go to bed probably pretty early because that's the only place you'd stay warm, and they'd probably go to bed at 7 o'clock and stay in bed till 8 o'clock the next morning, spending 12 hours in bed. They couldn't sleep that whole time. So the process of sleeping was very differently viewed than it is today. We think in very much more efficient terms. You go to bed, you should be asleep in 5 minutes, sleep solidly, and out of bed, pop out of bed at the other end of it. So what has happened here? Here's the Wizard of Id. The century is starting to get a bit carried away, and 3 o'clock the king's a fink, but 4 o'clock the sentries and the guards in the clink. So the king obviously happened to be awake at 3 a.m. Does he have insomnia? Well, now you know the answer, not necessarily. Another idea about sleep is that sleep is very fragile. This is what insomniacs feel. And they say things like, my sleep is very fragile. I have to be very careful not to do things during the day that'll disturb my sleep. Sort of like walk around on tippy toes so you don't disturb the person with insomnia. The harder I try, the worse it gets. I have very light sleep. I wake up to everything. And they'll say this too. But then the bed partner will say, but you didn't wake up to that thunderstorm last night. And they'll say, no, there wasn't any thunderstorm last night. So it's impossible to test if you didn't wake up to something because you never know about it. I think I've forgotten how to sleep. But what we try to get across to the insomniacs is, in fact, sleep is really very robust. It's a basic biological mechanism. What happens if you deprive a good sleeper of sleep entirely one night, an 8-hour good sleeper? They'll feel tired the next day, but if you allow them recovery sleep on the next night, they'll get 10 hours of sleep, and they'll feel fine the next day after that. Okay. What about the insomniac? How does their system respond? Now, the person with insomnia might be getting 5 or 6 hours of actual sleep. Sleep deprive them totally one night. They feel sleepy and tired the next day, too. Keep them awake until the next night, and they'll get a tremendous recovery sleep of 8 hours of sleep on a lower level than the good sleeper, but they'll get a recovery sleep, and they'll feel wonderful the next day. I talk about Randy Gardner, who holds the Guinness Book of Records of 11 days and nights without sleep, a young chap in California, Southern California, I must mention, Northern California. Crazy people live down in the South. And Randy, what happened to Randy? 11 days and nights. Won't you die from that? No, there was no actual evidence of any physical impairment that was produced by that. The only thing that happened is he got extremely sleepy. He got sleepier and sleepier. So if he got through, getting through the night was the difficult part. About 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, that was when he really struggled. And the only way to get through those times was to keep physically active, jogging in place and everything. If you could get through that period of time, you'd make it through the next day without much difficulty. And this refers to the circadian rhythms, which I'll talk about shortly. Finally, the 11th night, he just became physically exhausted, and so he sat down and he was asleep instantaneously, and he couldn't wake him up. Randy had 2 or 3 recovery sleeps. The first sleep was about 12 hours, the next one was about 10 hours, and he's back to normal. No physical sort of repercussions of that. So this is what I tell my clients. Thank you. And so I'll skip over that slide because we are running a little bit behind. Also, I tell them about the Australian sea lions. How many people have been down to Kangaroo Island and seen the sea lions on the south coast? Could I see a show of hands? How many people have seen them? Yeah, good. Slightly higher percentage than in my client group. So you're slightly better traveled than they are. And so you go down and you see one of the secrets of South Australia, a beach full of sea lions asleep. And you scratch your head thinking, are they nocturnal animals? Maybe at nighttime if I come back, they'll all be playing footy and having a great time or something. No, they're not nocturnal animals. They're just catching up on sleep because the ranger will explain they've been out fishing, basically, for a long period of time. And they're now a protected colony, and they have grown very large in size. They have to go out a long distance to get enough fish. So food requirements, of course, force them out for 2 or 3 days straight. Now, these are air-breathing mammals, like us. They can't sleep in the ocean, not any more than, to say, a 1-minute power nap, but that doesn't satisfy basically your sleep needs. And so they're out sleep depriving themselves until they get enough food, back on the beach, crash, sleep, recovery sleep. Recovery sleep for a couple of days, 2 or 3 days. By that stage, they're getting hungry again, and they've caught up on their sleep, so back they go into the ocean. And here we have a few pictures of the Kangaroo Island sea lions. And they're so sleepy they can even sleep on a rock, and they have to now because there's so many other sea lions taking up the beach. And the only ones that are really active on the beach are the little puppies that don't go out swimming. They're wanting to get some activity, and they just play with each other and not the adults who are all asleep. And this doesn't seem to harm them. This isn't a genetically determined sleep-wake pattern, because if you take a look at the Australian sea lions in the zoo, they sleep and wake more like dogs and cats, your pets. They'll wake for a few hours, and they'll sleep for a few hours, awake for a few hours, and on they go like that. All right, now the next thing I'd like to tell you about is mental activity. Mental activity isn't sleep one long period of unconsciousness? Well, it is in the sense of contact with the external world, but our brains don't go to sleep entirely. Activity drops a little bit, maybe 10%, but neural activity is still there a lot, so what's going on in the brain? Well, mental activity is going on. In REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, we wake them up out of REM sleep, and they'll most of the time report dreams. These vivid, colorful, bizarre, unrealistic, emotional sort of events that we're embedded in. And so you wake up people, and they can tell you what they've been thinking about, and what they're thinking about is this a dreamlike activity. Not all the time from REM sleep, but most of the time. But REM sleep only accounts for about 90 minutes across the night in these patches. All the rest of the time we're in non-REM sleep. But if you wake up people out of non-REM sleep, they'll also report mental activity. It's not as bizarre, it's not as colorful, it's more mundane, it's more thought-like. And it's more difficult to tell the difference between that type of mental activity and normal wakeful mental activity. Subtle differences, but it's not easy. And this can lead to misperceptions about what's happening to you and what you've just been experiencing. Let's go back to the REM sleep and where nightmares can take place. And I like this little cartoon of R2-D2. His recurrent nightmare, he is mistaken as a fire hydrant, and this group of dogs is about ready to cover him in some acidic solution that will short-circuit all his electronics. Or how many of you have been to the ghost train at the Royal Show? It's been around long enough to include all of us, probably. But going into the ghost train is a bit like going into another period of REM sleep. So why is it important about this sleep perception issue? Here's a Peanuts cartoon, and I'm not sure who this character is. I think her name's Marcia, but somebody else could correct me. No, it's not Lucy. No. Lucy is the one that keeps beating up Charlie Brown. And so Marcia's asleep in class. The teacher says, "Are you asleep? Are you awake?" He says, "Yes, I'm awake, I'm awake." "No, ma'am, I don't know what's going on, but I'm awake." So she misperceived that she was awake. Mental thoughts are probably going through her mind, and when she was woken up, she just, "Well, I was just resting my eyes." And probably a more common experience of all of us is we're watching television late at night, and all of a sudden your partner is snoring and missing the program, so you elbow him and say, wake up, John, you're missing Tony Jones on Late Line." And he immediately wakes up and says, "What? Why'd you hit me?" I said, "Because you were sleeping. You're missing the show." "I wasn't sleeping. I was just resting my eyes. I was listening to it." "Oh, yeah? What was he talking about?" And, no response because he can't say. "I wasn't asleep." "Yes, you were. You were snoring." "No, I wasn't snoring." So this argument goes on probably many times in most people's homes. So sleep-wake misperception. It is a difficult thing to perceive it because this doesn't happen to us when we wake up at nighttime. If somebody's recording and great cymbals clash to say, "You have now awoken." This just doesn't happen. There's a smooth transition from experiencing sleep mental activity into wakefulness where you're now starting to experience a subtle change in the type of mental activity. So it's hard to see that awakening quite often from sleep. Our research has looked at sleep misperception both in good sleepers and in people with insomnia. It's true, and it has been for a long time known, that insomniacs underestimate their total sleep time, on an average about 1 to 2 hours. And that means that their objective sleep, which is usually between 5 and 6 hours, is now perceived as something like 3 or 4 hours. That's a lot different than what you're being told by the media all the time. You should be getting 7 or 8 hours of solid sleep. So that's a source of concern. That concern and worry is helping to perpetuate the insomnia. When we wake up good sleepers out of sleep and ask them, "Were you awake or asleep just before the buzzer went off," which woke them up, they'll say 30% of the time, "No, I think I was already awake." So the judgment even of good sleepers is not very good. But for people with chronic insomnia, about 70% of the time they'll say, "I was awake already." "How long were you awake?" "Oh, well, since the last time you woke me up, which might have been an hour earlier." And so their feeling was that even though when you ask them, "What were you thinking about?" they'll be able to report something, but it'll only be a little snippet of thing, a sentence. And somehow that still accounts for an hour's worth of wakefulness. It doesn't. So logically it doesn't fit, but they still, we think, attribute that mental activity to a sign that they've been awake, and so therefore underestimate their total sleep time. As a result of this, we now regularly use sleep recordings with our people that have insomnia, and we can show them objectively what's happened to their sleep across the night in the context of their sleep diary that they keep for that same night. And so sometimes they'll say, "Oh, I only got 3 hours of sleep." And we can show them, "Well, in fact, you got 6 hours of sleep, but you had a few awakenings across there, and we think the reason that you've sort of misjudged this is because of such and they are usually pretty good at taking that in, and it's a great relief for them to know that they sleep more than they thought they did. So just to elaborate that mechanism, we might be aware that we're awake at 6:45, but the question is, what was happening during this time when they knew they were awake at 5:30? And most of the time, the chronic insomniacs will assume they've been awake for that whole time. So there are many cognitive elements that can contribute and perpetuate insomnia. Misinformation about the nature of sleep. So now we know sleep is like a roller coaster across the night, and that awakenings are a perfectly normal part of the sleep pattern. And particularly as we get older, the awakenings become more prominent. But those shouldn't interfere with daytime functioning. Sleep need declines with age, and sleep is robust. It does bounce back, so the insomniac should not be frightened of losing a bit of sleep. In fact, some of the behavioral therapies, which I'll now talk about, make use of that strong sleep mechanism. And sleep is often underestimated, and we can show people how that happens. All right, so the B part is CBT, and even though the C comes first in the title CBT, and even though I've described the cognitive elements, the behavioral therapies are really the mainstay of any effective cognitive behavior therapy for insomnia. They really do work, and they've been around for 30 years. But there are different behavioral therapies for different types of insomnia. There's therapy that's been around the longest, was invented by one of my colleagues from overseas, Richard Boutsen, called stimulus control therapy. It's a fancy name. Simple instructions. Don't go to bed until sleepy. Get out of bed, if not asleep, in 15 minutes. In other words, if you're still awake after 15 minutes, get out of bed. Go back to the room that you're in, doing whatever you're doing, and only go back to bed when you're sleepy again. But to keep repeating this process until eventually you fall asleep really quickly. Get up each morning at the same time, even on the weekends. Don't nap during the day, even if you're feeling really sleepy now. And reserve the bedroom for sleep and sex. So the idea is to change the association of the bedroom only with sleep and not long periods of time awake. So you can write these prescription or menu down easily. It's not so easy to comply, as you can imagine, particularly in the wintertime if you have to get out of bed and go back into the cold living room or something. So we try to help our clients to prepare for this, that they'll probably have to get out of bed 3 or 4 times on the first night, maybe a few times on the second night, and so on. But over a week or two, they are falling asleep more quickly, and they're falling asleep earlier and starting to get more sleep. But we do use the buildup of sleep pressure over time as a result of not getting enough sleep because they have to get up at a fixed time regardless of when they got to sleep. So sleep pressure will build up in the first few nights, and that'll work for us to ensure more rapid sleep onsets. Now, a second behavior therapy I want to mention is called intensive sleep retraining. We called it FAST to begin with, Flinders Accelerated Sleep Therapy. But we talked to our colleagues overseas, and they said, no, that's not a good idea. Make it a neutral title. It seemed to be bragging too much. And so in the true Australian tradition, shuffle, shuffle, gee, just lucky, I guess. We didn't want to brag too much about this, so we call it intensive sleep retraining. It's sort of an extension of stimulus control therapy. In fact, Richard Boutsen was a colleague on this research project with us. And it's a bit bizarre, and it got a lot of media attention. A lot of people wanting to fly interstate to Flinders to get this sort of treatment. It basically condenses the stimulus control therapy into a 24-hour period. How does it do that? Well, we ask them to restrict their sleep to 5 hours on Friday night. Then they come in on Saturday night. They get hooked up to the EEG machine so we can measure sleep. And then they're given sleep opportunities to fall asleep. So at 10 o'clock, they're put to bed, lights are turned out, and they have 25 minutes in which to fall asleep. If they don't fall asleep in 25 minutes, we turn the lights back on, and we try it again at 10:30, and then at 11 o'clock, and so on. If they do fall asleep, if they're lucky enough to fall asleep in 25 minutes, and most of these people are taking in their home environment an hour or two to fall asleep. These are sleep onset insomniacs. If they do fall asleep in less than 25 minutes, we let them sleep for 1 or 2 minutes, then we wake them up. Because we want to continue the sleep deprivation. We want to give them an experience of falling asleep quickly. Well, the first time, 20 minutes, that's not very quick. But just like clockwork, by 3 or 4 a.m. in the morning, at that stage, virtually all of them are falling asleep in less than 5 minutes. And then we have to keep them awake until the next half-hour point. Usually we have to go into the bedroom to make sure that they're kept awake because they're starting to feel really sleepy. And then for the rest of Saturday night and all the way through Sunday, we continue the same routine. And Sunday night, we finally allow them to go home. They have a recovery sleep of 8 hours. That's how we know that insomniacs will get a great recovery sleep after sleep deprivation. And it doesn't hurt them. They do feel increasingly sleepy, but it's a great revelation to them because they thought they would die if they didn't get any sleep. They feel that their insomnia makes them feel so miserable, if they miss out on a whole night of sleep, they couldn't imagine getting through life like that. So they experience up to 48 rapid sleep onsets across this whole period of time. So they essentially condense several weeks of stimulus-controlled therapy into one 24-hour period. And that's made a few headlines overseas and drawn quite a lot of attention. And it's put up there along with stimulus-controlled therapy as a new therapy that's going to be just as effective. Its effectiveness was as good as stimulus-controlled therapy. When you combine it with stimulus-controlled therapy, it's more effective than either of them alone. But the behavioral therapy, it probably works best and used the most. Sorry, it doesn't work best. It's used the most, particularly for sleep maintenance problems, people waking up across the night. And this is particularly true in the older population. And as the name says, bedtime restriction therapy. So we often find that the insomniacs are spending a lot of time in bed, maybe 9 hours or 10 hours. They go to bed at 10 o'clock at night. It takes them half an hour, fall asleep. They sleep for a couple hours. They're awake for an hour in the middle of the night. They wake up again later on. And they wake up, get out of bed finally at 7 a.m. So they're spending 9 hours of bed. They're reporting 5 hours of sleep. So they're spending 4 hours in bed awake, associating their bedroom environment with worry about the fact that they're awake and concern and anxiety. So what we do is basically squash that period down. They go to bed later, wake up earlier for at least a week. Sleep pressure builds up because they don't get as much sleep as they normally do. And then at the end of the week, if their sleep is well consolidated in that shorter period of time, and if they're starting to get really sleepy before going to bed, if they're struggling to stay awake, well then relax that period of time in bed by half an hour, let it expand out a little bit. At the end of the next week, if they're still doing well and they're still sleepy, we'll expand it out again, and so on like that, until they get to the point where they're now feeling good during the day, they're no longer sleepy or fatigued. And that's very effective for not only improving their sleep, but their daytime functioning and how they feel. The body clock is the other biological mechanism that influences sleep, apart from the sleep propensity and sleep drive. And that's what most of our research has been focused on for the last 20 years. There is a real mechanism in the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. That's a long name, so we just call it the SCN. And this schematic diagram, you can see schematic diagram of the brain, and the SCN is located here, about 2 or 3 centimeters behind the eyes. It actually gets direct neural input from the retina of the eyes. So the SCN, the body clock, is able to be told, is it daytime or nighttime, about changes of light intensity. There are several rhythms involved in the body clock. Any measure you take shows a 24-hour cycling. Core body temperature shows this type of variation for a person who is normally entrained, that is, normally has sleep between 11 and 7. A high point here about 6 or 7 p.m., then it drops quickly down to its low point about here at about 3 or 4 a.m., then up it goes again like that. Other measures you can take are melatonin, showing flatness during the day, goes up during the night and down during the night. All these physiological changes across the 24-hour period are linked together and have a very strong effect on sleep propensity. So sleep propensity is maximum in this period of time here, minimum here. So in other words, it's actually very difficult to fall asleep at this point. So we call this the circadian bed. This is the best time to sleep across a 24-hour period. And if you've ever done night shift, you would have experienced how strong that is. If you try to stay awake across the night during this period of time, you struggle. And then you think, oh, I just have to get home and go to bed. And you go home and get to bed, but then it takes you a lot longer to fall asleep. You're less sleepy. And likewise, if you fly across time zones and you're trying to sleep at your circadian wakeful time, it's difficult. And if you're trying to stay awake when you're actually during the daytime, when you're in your circadian bed, it's difficult as well until your body finally readjusts. But this circadian bed is surrounded by 2 sleep-inhibited zones, a wake maintenance zone that inhibits sleep, and also on the other side, a wake-up zone that if you're asleep during this period of time and come into it, you'll tend to be woken up. And so we have been interested in the idea that mistiming of this body clock, that is, if it drifts later, we can have the wake-up maintenance zone drift into the time when a person is trying to fall asleep and inhibit sleep. And this could be a cause of sleep onset insomnia. Likewise, for early morning awakening insomnia, it may be that your rhythm is timed too early, and you come into the wake-up zone at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, you wake up then, and you can't get back to sleep. And so certain types of insomnia we think are related to circadian rhythm mistiming. Delayed circadian rhythms lead to sleep onset insomnia, and early time circadian rhythms lead to early morning awakening insomnia. But the good news is we can retime the body clock. If it's abnormal in those types of insomnia, we can retime them. How does that happen? Bright light is the signal. Bright light stimulation in the morning, at the end of the sleep period, will tend to shift the sleep period back earlier and the whole circadian system back earlier. Bright light in the evening, however, will tend to delay the body clock. So we got interested in the administration of bright light therapy. All during our experiments, we used the conventional large light box, producing a lot of light, consuming a lot of power, has to be plugged into the main circuit, and it's placed about a meter away from the person, but there they have to sit to get their light therapy for 1 or 2 hours, and not being able to do much else. If they turn away, it's no longer effective. If they move to their side of the room, it's no longer effective. So they've got to keep themselves there in that location. We thought there must be a better way. We must be able to produce a better method of light treatment. So it occurred to me that all we have to do is to bring a light source much closer to the eyes, and it can be a much smaller light source. So the ultimate extent is a light-emitting diode. One of those things you see on computers and so forth that are in your car that light up different colors. You can bring them really close to the eyes. They produce very little light, but as much light gets through the pupil onto the retina as a big light box further away, or the sun very much further away. And a little light-emitting diode can be powered on a little tiny battery, and so it can be much more portable, and you can walk around and you can do things as you're getting your light therapy. So we started to use light-emitting diodes then as a way of producing light stimulation, and this is the first iteration of it. This is our Buddy Holly glasses. For those of you familiar with the 1960s music, you'll recognize the glasses. Still have to require a battery pack like this and a line to it. 2 little blue-green light-emitting diodes here that ensure that light goes into the eyes all the time, no matter where a person's looking or what they're doing. So we thought this was a good idea, and the university likes us to exploit ideas that may be marketable, don't they? And so the research background is that we've shown that sleep onset insomnia is associated with delayed circadian rhythms. Morning bright light retimes the rhythms earlier and effectively treats sleep onset insomnia. Early morning awakening insomnia, another common type of insomnia, is associated with early time circadian rhythms. And evening bright light can retime the rhythm to a later time and, as it turns out, can effectively treat this type of insomnia. And so Flinders University, in its attempt to commercialize ideas, has its commercial wing, Flinders Partners. And Flinders Partners, a couple of years ago, created a company called Retime. And in conjunction with the Medical Devices Partnering Program up at Flinders University, they have been able to create what are called now the retimers. And these look a little bit more modern than our Buddy Holly glasses, where the stalk down here holds the LEDs, and a little tiny button battery can power this for a few hours before it needs to be recharged with a USB port you can plug into the computer. But you can get several hours of use out of that, and it can provide your light stimulation at a comfortable level continuously. And they should be available later this year, I'm told. But one final advertisement. Much of the details that I've talked about today you can find, if you're interested, in our little paperback book, Sleep Well, Live Better, 3 Steps to Good Sleep, very similar to the title of this talk. And this is available online at the healthbookshop.com. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you sleep well tonight.
You need to have the microphone for questions because we're recording the session. So if you've got a question, just raise your hand and we'll make sure you get a microphone. Okay, Sue up the back. 2 gentlemen right at the back.
Professor, you mentioned if you have difficulty going to sleep and after 15 minutes you should get up from bed and go and do something that you were doing before and then return back to bed. Is there not a risk with that you actually stimulate yourself by doing that, or what's your advice as to what you should do when you do get up?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and a lot of people with insomnia do have that worry. You know, if they move around too much, they might stimulate themselves, and that effect might last for a long time. But in fact, most good sleepers do this all the time. They'll get up from the television, walk to the bathroom, brush their teeth, get their clothes off, and do a lot of activity, place themselves in bed, but they're still asleep in 10 minutes. So that activity doesn't last very long. The effect of that activity doesn't last very long. And even though it might be present when you get up and go to another room, that's true. And when you walk back again, there'll be a little bit of activity that'll raise your activation level briefly and for a short period of time. But I think the main point of how it works into this therapy is that you're removing yourself from the bedroom environment. You're waiting until you're sleepy again, and inevitably this will mean that you don't actually fall asleep until quite late. So I think, in my own suspicion, is that sleep deprivation really is the thing that works well for this therapy. So you do really build up some sleep loss in the first night or two. That builds up sleep pressure, which you carry with you across the day, and you have to tell the clients, be prepared for this. It won't impact on you as much as you think it might. If you remain reasonably active and during the day, that sleep loss will hardly be noticeable. You'll feel a little bit more tired and you'll be looking forward to the next night. But it works over a period of several days. And I think it's the buildup of sleep pressure which inevitably helps people to start falling asleep more quickly. Yeah, but the activity itself, yes, it does transiently raise your activation level. But as soon as you lay down in bed, that drops back pretty quickly. There was a question at the back.
Hi. I do shift work, and generally I find the same thing. You tend to be really lagging at 3 or 4 in the morning, and you come home and then you're all of a sudden wide awake. Is there any technique that we can use coming off shift work, especially if it's just 1 or 2 nights at a time, to try and get back into a good sleep rhythm?
During the day?
Yes.
Well, no, I'm afraid not, because we could try, if you were a permanent night shift worker and you had, say, 4 or 5 night shifts in a row, it would be to your advantage probably to phase delay your body clock a bit by 3 or 4 hours, so that that real sleepy period comes quite later. In fact, it might be able to be moved into your sleep period itself, so that your sleep quality then would increase a lot and you'd be more alert during the night shift. So it's basically suggesting to a person to become jet lagged and to take on that type of new timing of their circadian rhythm, but on a more permanent basis. Even though permanent night shift workers are quite often reluctant to do that because they have their social commitments. Often they'll have family and children to look after, and so it just doesn't work into their life to be able to do that. If they're living alone and they're a permanent night shift worker, it can be a lot easier, and that would be a sensible thing to do. But that does show you the power of the circadian rhythms in determining sleepiness at that 3 or 4 or 5 a.m. time, and then alertness a few hours later.
Yes, okay. Now we'll just have to do this in some order. So Sue will just be down here with the microphone. And if you could put your hand up where you were at the back so we can just see you again. Thank you.
I wonder if you've got any sort of thoughts or comments, like one of the things that for women, particularly during the perimenopausal period, is the sort of fluctuating hormones, and that's a time when I think the hormones have a particularly sort of powerful effect on sleep, and maybe there are times when sort of that may be the case for men as well. So have you got any sort of thoughts about that, Leon?
Well, that's not really my area of expertise, but we do know that in the second half of the menstrual cycle, the luteal phase, I think, body temperature is a little bit higher at nighttime than in the follicular phase, and sleep is a little bit shorter as well. But in the menopausal sort of experience, I guess, hormones are fluctuating quite a bit. And so I can well imagine that it might interfere with sleep. And certainly that is about the time, though, too, when people just through age are waking up more frequently and becoming all sweaty and everything is uncomfortable and likely to wake up a person, too. And it can become a focus of chagrin and anxiety, and that can be a time when it becomes exacerbated and becomes an insomnia problem. Hopefully it doesn't last very long and you're through it, but the medical profession would have a solution of hormone replacement therapy if it became very severe, I guess. And sometimes that does alleviate the sleep problem too. I don't know if it just puts it off for a later time or not, but I'm not sure. But I don't have much experience with that. But it is a time. There are times in people's lives when they first become a parent, and their infant is crying during the night, and they have to get up and feed it, take care of it, maybe 2 or 3 times a night. So their sleep is broken by that, and that's difficult to get through. I know from personal experience. And then when the child is finally sleeping all through the night, then the parent's left with waking up 3 or 4 times a night. It sort of becomes a conditioned habit to some extent. And insomnia can develop from those things and then become self-perpetuating. And so quite often with chronic insomniacs, the original stress or stimulus that might have triggered it off originally may no longer be there. But the stress of having insomnia is still there, and the conditioned habits are there. But they can be reversed. Almost always it takes a bit of, where there's no pain, there's no gain, I'm afraid. 2 or 3 weeks of investment of time in the behavioral therapies is well worth it for actually reversing that insomnia for the long term. So the cognitive behavior therapies really do address the causes of the insomnia itself, and so are more likely to affect a cure than the drug therapies. They've been put one-on-one with each other, and generally it's assumed that even though it's a bit like the tortoise and the hare type of story again, the drugs are like the hare. They sprint off at the beginning, but then they tend to get worn out. The tortoise just keeps getting better and better. And the crossover point where the cognitive behavior therapies are working better than the drug therapies is thought to be around 2 or 3 weeks. From that point onwards, they're actually working better than the drug therapies, even while the drugs are still being consumed. Of course, when you stop the drugs, then your sleep, collapses entirely. Gradually recovers after that, but going through the withdrawal is not easy.
Okay, I think we've got our next question. Yes.
Sure. Hi, Leon. Is there any relationship between sleep apnea and insomnia?
Yes, there is. It was felt, I think, in the early days of the sort of sleep disorders medicine area that these were 2 very different types of disorders. And the demographic characterization of them were very different, too. It was conceived that the sleep apneic, that is sleep and breathing problems, when you fall asleep, you get a blockage to your air supply, and that chokes you basically and changes blood oxygen levels, and you wake up, even out of deep sleep. And you wake up enough to start breathing again, and then you fall back to sleep again. And you go through that event many times. And it's a very disruptive to sleep, and people usually with sleep apnea are extremely sleepy during the day, whereas the insomniacs tend to be fatigued and not sleepy. They're hypervigilant, but they're just feeling washed out entirely. So different types of symptoms, and the demographics of them are very different too. It was conceived that sleep apnea is mainly a problem of middle-aged overweight men with big, fat, thick necks, and that insomnia was the province of older, thin, hyperexcitable women. And so because these were sort of different characterizations, they must be entirely different. But no, that's really a simplified stereotype. And it turns out that, in fact, a lot of women have sleep apnea, and a lot of men have insomnia. And it's not only fat people or heavy overweight people that have sleep apnea. And there's a lot of overlap between these. We find in our studies that about 30 to 40% of the people referred for sleep apnea and who do have sleep apnea also have insomnia. And we find in the insomnia clinic, people that only had symptoms of insomnia come in, we find about 30 to 40% of them have sleep apnea as well, treatable sleep apnea. So we think there's a reason for that amount of overlap, that they are synergistic to some extent. And maybe that the sleep apnea is causing awakenings out of light sleep for some of those people that wake up more easily. And those awakenings out of light sleep, every time they try to initiate sleep, maybe go on for several attempts, and eventually they feel like they've been awake for the last hour. And so they're a sleep onset insomnia. But in fact, they're sleep apneic. They're going to sleep, but waking up, going to sleep, waking up, and they don't see any of their sleeps at all. As far as they're concerned, they're just still awake. And they developed chronic insomnia, but they had initially sleep apnea. So yes, there's a lot of overlap between those two.
Okay, we're on our next question.
Aren't there situations where one can sleep too much?
That's an interesting question that almost always comes up in groups like this. It hasn't been researched very well, so I can't give you a research answer to it. But I suspect that the feeling that people have of, quote, sleeping too much, what do they mean by that? Well, they had a nice long sleep last night, but I feel really pretty lethargic today. Why is that? Oh, I slept too much. I think what happens is that the body goes into a recovery from perhaps many nights of too little sleep. And the recovery puts the whole body into a subdued mode, if you like. I won't go into the details about the autonomic nervous system, but part of it is the fight or flight mechanism, energizes whenever we see a threat. The other part calms us down when there's no threat, when we're eating and sleeping. Those two balance against each other. And I think the body, during the work days, is sort of in the fight or flight mode to some extent. And then you go into the weekend, perhaps that's the time you experience longer sleeps and lethargy the next day. And the whole body goes into a recovery phase, essentially, from that work week. Hopefully that's why we have weekends. But I think that's what's happening. But then if you give yourself a longer sleep the next night and the next night again, I would predict that the person would start coming out of that and starting to feel really refreshed. So I think it's probably the first recovery sleep, long recovery sleep that you have, after a series of sleeps that are probably too short and getting inadequate sleep. That might be a partial explanation, but maybe not the whole explanation. But this experiment that gave people unlimited sleep opportunity, they slept longer and they felt better, a little bit better. Not better enough to warrant the extra 5 hours of time in bed.
Okay, we're on to our next question. Yes.
Hi, you spoke a little bit about how exposure to light can shift circadian rhythms back. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the light maybe from computers and the light from televisions and stuff, whether that is playing a part in shifting our circadian rhythms back as a whole as in society?
Yeah, and especially if you use these devices late at night, the thought is this delaying my circadian rhythm? Is this making it more difficult in the long run to get to sleep at an early time? That's a very valid possibility. But the measures we actually take from a television or from a computer don't indicate that there's enough light there to be of much effect. Although it's had a lot of media coverage, particularly with adolescents and children using these things in their bed environment. I think the biggest difficulty with these devices is that it energizes the person. In other words, you're interacting with something. You're talking to your girlfriend or boyfriend on your iPhone, or you're playing a computer game that's pretty vicious, and you're really excited about that, and it'll take a while for that to die back down again. That's certainly a much stronger effect than the light effect coming from it.
Okay, I think we had another question. That's right. Over here. Yes.
And there's one over here too.
I was wondering if in the last couple of years when lots of people have now got smartphones, have you noticed many people coming into your clinic who are using sleep apps on their phones? And do you think those are good or bad?
Yes, well, of course, you have to have an app for everything these days. And it was a smart little idea. In fact, there are devices that are sold in Japan that are based on the same idea, too, which is it measures activity. And so you sleep with your iPhone, and it's programmed. You program it to give yourself a wake-up window, if you like, maybe 30 minutes. And say you have to, at the very latest, you have to get out of bed at, say, 7 o'clock. So you give yourself a wake-up window from 6:30 to 7.